To be honest, the only retribution which comes into my brain when I think of this movie is that which I would like to do to Paul Anderson for making me watch this movie. So this was the fifth Resident Evil film. Milla Jovavich returned as Alice. Paul Anderson came back for his third go-around as director out of the 5 films that had been released up to this point. The story is very simple. Alice is captured at the beginning of the movie and dumped into this underground testing facility owned by Umbrella. It's way down beneath some kind of frozen lake in the middle of Russia. So it's sort of similar in a way, plot-wise, to the original Resident Evil film, but it's certainly nowhere near as good. And the problems of this film begin in the casting. A lot was made in the marketing very early on that there would be returning fan favourites, I guess you'd call them, such as Michelle Rodriguez's Rain character from the first movie, whoever Colin Salmon was playing from the first movie, Carlos Oliveira from the second and the third film. A lot of returning characters. The trouble is they're all dead. You can only really bring them back as clones. And what did we learn in Alien Resurrection? Watching clones in a movie is boring. They are soulless and in absolutely no way the same as their human originals. I get not one whit of enjoyment out of watching these returning characters in Resident Evil Retribution. In the case of Rain, I never even liked the character originally. I thought she was one of the weaker aspects of the first film. So we've got all these dead people coming back, sort of, but none of the alive people from the end of the fourth film are coming back. So there's no Claire Redfield, there's no Chris Redfield, there's no Kmart. All these characters who survived with Alice at the end of the fourth film, they've mysteriously disappeared. This series had real trouble with keeping the same actors from film to film. They clearly had nobody tied into long-term contracts, so every time they did a movie, it was clearly a case of, oh, who've we got available, who've we not, and then they wrote the stories seemingly based on who they could get. And in this instance, they could get a bunch of people from the early films, but they couldn't get the characters they actually needed for the ongoing storyline. You know who they did manage to get back? Luther, the character we last saw surviving on his own in Los Angeles, but since the end of the previous film, he has somehow managed to get himself into a mercenary gang who is hired by Wesker to go and help Alice escape from this facility in Russia. It's a stretch. Jill Valentine's back for the first time since the second movie. This is a little bit more welcome because her character is actually still alive. She's just being mind controlled by the spider device that we first see in the fourth film. But she has nothing to do, Sienna Gilroy, in this film. All she does is stand around with a couple of Uzis and from time to time just goes... I think she's being punished in this movie, in all honesty, for having the temerity to turn down Paul Anderson for the third and the fourth film. She was supposed to be in the third film, but turned it down to do Eragon. I think if she'd have been in Resident Evil Extinction, she would have got a fuller part in the same way that she did in the second movie. But by coming back at this juncture, this is all they could give her, just turning her into this really robotic, soulless person, similar to all the other returning characters, really, even though they're clones. Also, Sienna Gilroy, I'm not sure how she does her hair in real life, but she's had a change of hairstyle for this film compared to how she had it in the second movie. I get that Afterlife sort of caused this problem by having that little cameo with her at the end where she changed her hair for that, but the trouble is her personality is also changing for this film, i.e. she doesn't have her personality, she's being mind controlled. What did we get taught in science class at school? If you're doing a science experiment, never change more than one factor at a time. Now, that's not exactly the same thing as this, but in this movie, two things about Jill are changed: her hair and her personality, and it's really disconcerting. Whenever there's a scene with Jill, I'm sort of straining, looking at the screen, at her facial features, just trying to convince myself that it is actually Sienna Gilroy. It shouldn't be that way. They should have just let her keep her hair for number 2. So let's get into the actual movie then, and it's got to be said the first 15 minutes of this are absolutely atrocious. It's a really wretched opening. The action begins exactly where it left off at the end of the 4th film, with Alice on the Arcadia tanker about to be confronted by a big fleet of gunships. This could have been a really cool mini battle to kick things off, but the trouble is Paul Anderson decides to play the whole thing in reverse. It's as if he watched Memento the night before he was due to film this and thought to himself, I'm going to have some of that. I'm sure it's very clever on a technical level what he's doing here, but it's frustrating to watch. The next scene after this is the obligatory Alice talks to the audience about the plot so far, except it seems to go on even longer than normal because there's now 4 films to catch up on. I just wish people would watch these films in order so we don't need scenes like this, or maybe people can just go on Google for a couple of minutes before they go into the cinema so they're up to date on the plot. Then we don't need to sit through this. Then, after this scene, we go back to the battle on the tanker, except now we're going to watch it forwards, except it's a bit late by this point. We've already seen it in reverse. The next scene after this takes us to the suburbia section of the testing facility, except obviously we don't know what this place is yet. So I guess we're meant to think, oh, look, Alice is in peril as a suburban housewife trying to survive a zombie onslaught, except we know this is not her. We know this is going to turn out to be a clone or a dream sequence. I guess it could be the real Alice and she's just had her memory wiped, but given she's sporting some kind of Taylor Swift hairdo in this scene, I think the odds are that it's going to turn out to be one of the other 2 options. And sure enough, she turns out to be a clone. So we have to sit through this tensionless scene, which is sort of reminiscent of the opening beats of the Dawn of the Dead remake, but not as good. And then just to make it even better, Rain turns up, sporting even less personality than she had in the first movie, thus proving the old adage, it never rains, it pours. The testing facility as a whole probably sounded really good on paper when this film was being planned. You know, the idea of all these big cavernous rooms where Umbrella conduct dummy outbreaks, but the reality of it on film, I mean, the whole place, every room just feels really lifeless and fake. It doesn't help that the New York section feels more or less the same as the Tokyo section. The suburbia section is really dull. The Moscow room is really grimy and boring as well. There's not a single place in this facility which I actually like, in all honesty. And the whole place is populated by monsters and creatures that we've already seen from the previous movies. There's nothing new. In every other film up to this point, there's been some kind of new monster or creature or villain who's taken supplements to become something really disgusting, but not this time. Every single monster and creature here, as far as I'm aware, has just been plucked from the previous films. It's like when a band has no new material, so they just release a greatest hits album. That's what this film is, past characters and all. It reminds me of video games which have randomly generated levels just to extend the replayability, you know, For your viewing pleasure, here is a couple of Axemen with a New York wallpaper, And over here we have a liquor in Moscow surroundings, you see, original material. No, it isn't. The ending aboard the facility on the ice, it has my least favorite trope in all of cinema, where basically the protagonist gets their butt kicked for like 5 minutes, and then just as they're about to die, they get in their one hit which knocks out the villain somehow. I cannot stand it when movies do this, and it happens here. Now, one thing I've not mentioned so far is the fact that there are some new characters who are brought in from the video game. So it's become a tradition by this point of the series that they would at least try and introduce 1 or more characters that are in the games. And this time we get 3. So there's Ada Wong, who's actually pretty good, actually. I mean, there's no backstory to the character, really. There's no depth, but she's quite entertaining in this film, to be fair. There's Leon Kennedy, although he looks what I always think Chris Redfield to look like somehow. I'm sure I've seen an animated film or there's been a game where Chris Redfield looks exactly like Leon does in this film, although I could be getting my characters mixed up, so don't hold that one against me if I'm wrong. There's also a Barry Burton, but he doesn't feel like the Barry Burton from the games. Oh, Barry Burton's death in this. If you want a moment where this series possibly jumps the shark, this is it. So Barry Burton, he's got this wound that a liquor gave him, so he thinks he's going to die. So he decides to just try and take out a couple more bad guys before he goes. So he jumps out from behind this wall and tries to take out as many people as he can, but then he gets shot all over his chest, like multiple gunshot wounds. So he goes down to the ground, but his magnum gun flies up into the air as he's going down to the ground, and it appears like he's dead. He's like down on the floor. He's like, oh. But then the magnum gun falls exactly down towards him. So he opens his eyes, catches it, blows away the Colin Salmon clone, and it's like, oh my God, Paul Anderson, what were you thinking? I do have a couple of positive things to say before I wrap up. So firstly, there's a really good fight scene in a long white corridor. Alice is performing some kind of gun fu. She's shooting people 1 minute and using martial arts the next. I enjoyed that for the 60 seconds or so that it was happening. And I'm also pleased to say that Wesker is back in this film, albeit only for a couple of scenes. If you saw my review for Afterlife, you'll know that I was singing from the highest of hills about Sean Roberts' performance as Wesker. Well, he's back here, and it's no coincidence that his two scenes are two of the best in the film. In fact, the second of those, which takes place at the White House right at the end, is pretty good, actually. When the camera pulls back from the White House and we see this huge battlefield full of people and monsters and stuff, it reminds me of the third Lord of the Rings film, although I do sort of doubt Wesker's claim that this is humanity's last stand. How does he know that there aren't pockets of people still left all over the globe? And doesn't that actually turn out to be the case in the sixth film? But we'll get to that one in the fullness of time. But for now, let me just wrap up by saying this is a really horrendous film, in all honesty. I mean, compared to the fourth film, this is a really steep climb down. It's just all gloss and no substance. It's daylight robbery at the cinema door. And as a long-time Resident Evil fan of both films and games, I really, really was not happy about this one. So let's get to the bag of terror and find out what sort of score we're going to give for Resident Evil Retribution. That's it. That's all I've got for this one bloody axe. And when you consider that the previous film scored 4.5 bloody axes out of 5, you can imagine just how shocking a film this was, really. So I guess that's all there is to say. I will be back soon to do Resident Evil, the final chapter. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.